you very much, everybody, for being here today for our third Humane seminar. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here today. Before we begin, just a quick reminder to please keep your microphones muted while our speaker is presenting. We're recording this session for the benefit of those who can't be here today. And in terms of the structure of how today is going to run, we'll begin with a talk from our guest, Professor Andrew Piper, and we'll then open the floor for any questions which arise from that presentation. So the event will last around 50 or so minutes in duration, including the Q&A as well. So I thought I'd just give you a quick introduction to today and then introduce our speaker. It's a really fascinating topic that we've got prepared for you today. When we talk about AI at the moment, we very quickly tend to end up talking about stories and systems that summarize novels. They continue as seen in the style of Virginia Woolf. They generate fan fiction. They script dialogues for games and chatbots. They're no longer purely speculative. So they're products, they're platforms, they're research benchmarks. And with that shift, a particular question surfaces, which we're going to address today, Andrew. What happens when machines learn to tell stories and when engineers get to decide what counts as a good story? So from the humanities perspective, the tests are never just neutral yardsticks, if you like. They materialize particular assumptions about what narrative is and what it is for. So work in narrative theory, for example, reminds us that stories do many things at once. They structure time, they allocate attention, they distribute interiority, they encode norms about whose experiences matter. And I think all of this means that the question, is this a good story, can't be separated from questions like good for whom or according to which tradition. So humanities scholarship gives us that rich vocabulary for thinking about form, for thinking about genre, voice, and power. And this is why I'm really pleased that we have Andrew Piper here with us today. His work sits right at this intersection. And this afternoon, I'd like to take an opportunity to see his talk to enable us to think together about how we might reimagine AI story generation. So I'm just going to introduce Andrew Piper, who is Professor of Languages, Literatures and Cultures at McGill University, where he leads .txt Lab, a pioneering research group in cultural analytics that explores how computation can deepen our understanding of storytelling, reading and cultural history. Bridging literary criticism and data science, his work examines how human narratives are structured, evaluated, and experienced, both by readers and increasingly by machines. He directs McGill's MA in Digital Humanities and a citizen science initiative called Citizen Readers, which promotes transparent which promotes transparent use of AI in cultural research. He's the author of Enumerations, Data and Literary Study, and Can We Be Wrong? The Problem of Textual Evidence in a Time of Data. His research investigates how quantitative methods might renew the humanistic study of literature. His essays have appeared in The Atlantic, The Guardian, and Public Books, and his forthcoming book, Why You Should Read More Fiction, What AI Can Tell Us About the Embodied Mind of Storytelling, explores what AI reveals about the cognitive and emotional life of narrative. So over to Andrew Piper for today's lecture.
Thanks, Dean. I appreciate the invitation to be here. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And I am a Teams newbie, so I'm going to do my best to navigate the interface without too much glitchiness. So I've got to set up my Keynote here application. So let's see if I can do that. Allow to share window. Oh no. Oh boy. Let's see. I had a feeling this might happen. It's only letting me share PowerPoint Live, not the Keynote that I have set up. Hold on, everybody. Choose what you want to share. Share window. Okay. share this window. Great. Okay. Are you seeing the slides?
Yeah.
All right. And then if I do that, are you still seeing the slides? Continue to share. Yeah. How's that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay. So I figured my talk had a bit of a, like, it sounded like a gag. Humanist and engineer walk into a bar, and what do they see? Or they start telling stories to each other. And so the general goal of my talk is, and this is, I think, something that it can be really important for humanists to do more generally, is really engage with benchmarking in the AI field. These are generally frameworks that are established by engineers to assess model performance. And as AI becomes more and more of a cultural technology, I think there's a lot of opportunities for humanists to get involved in a kind of co-collaborative way, a co-creative way of thinking about how do we assess AI behavior. So I think there's a real opportunity for humanities and AI interaction there. And so my talk today is just going to really focus on a kind of tour of some prominent examples of storytelling quality evaluation papers, and then to kind of zoom out and take a big picture look at what we're seeing, and then also what the options or opportunities are for intervention there. Just a quick background about me. I started my career as a book historian and literary scholar. I'm very interested in the relationship between technology, in this case, printed books, and creativity. And so that kind of informed as I moved through time in my career. The computational turn happened for me in the 2010s, where I became very interested in the relationship between computational modeling and our understanding of language. And yeah, as Dean kindly mentioned, this is sort of all of this research over the past decade has culminated in my newest book coming out in the fall, Why You Should Read More Fiction, which really takes a kind of computational modeling approach to thinking about the value of fiction and tries to put it in conversation with cognitive science. What I've been doing since then, or alongside that, is really thinking about this field called computational narrative understanding. So this is a sort of subset of what we might call natural language processing, NLP, and now AI, that thinks about how do we model stories computationally, and now with generative AI, how do we generate them and evaluate their quality. So back in 2021, I collaborated with two colleagues to make a kind of first intervention where, very much like today with story generation, with story understanding, narrative understanding, what I was seeing was that there were a lot of really interesting papers, a lot of really interesting initiatives to begin to think about how we computationally model narrative, but they were really theory impoverished, or it was just kind of like a theory grab bag. Someone would write a paper, grab a theorist, throw it in, and use it. There was no real systematic approach to this. There was no real grounding in narratology. And so really my aim was just to introduce things like Jeanette's classic narrative triangle, and build out an understanding of narrative theory to facilitate the field of NLP to develop better narrative understanding tools. One of the contributions of that, which is as I was going through the literature, I realized that there was a kind of lack of a kind of like fundamental definition of narrative, right? What is the smallest kind of unit consist of? And so I sort of formalized it in this way, as it kind of rolls off the tongue. Someone tells someone somewhere for some reason that someone did something to someone somewhere at some time for some reason. And you can kind of use this as your base framework for thinking about, are you in a frame of narrative communication or some other kind of communication? So in other words, you have to have a narrator, some sort of mode of telling, a recipient, a social situation in which that's being told, and then a motivation for that telling. And then underneath the double line, the diegetic elements, you obviously have to have a character, an agent, an event, a location, time frame, motivation. And I won't go into it here, but these can be more or less explicit or implicit when you've got a narrative. And that's what makes narrative understanding challenging is, good writers will play with these aspects and make them more or less explicit. And that's what, you can think of very simple stories where all of this is very explicit. But the better they get and the more impactful they get, the more implicit many of these dimensions become, or more complicated. Followed up paper with thinking about even higher level dimensions, so multimodal narrative understanding across, starting to think about visual narratives as well, these structural shapes, and then collective schemas. So I'm very interested right now in this idea of collective narratives. That is to say, how do large scale narratives emerge out of many, many documents instead of thinking as a single document as a narrative? This is all kind of culminated in our most recent paper called Narrabench, where we try and put together a framework for narrative benchmarking. So this is a kind of framework. We don't have all of these benchmarks in place yet, but it gives engineers something to shoot for if we're going to really assess AI models' capability at narrative understanding. These are the dimensions drawn from classical narratology that we think are very important to assess. And as you can see, the list is not only quite long, but it has these different evaluation frameworks. And you can see in the lower right corner. In other words, what scale of the narrative are we talking about? Is it a local phenomena or is it a global phenomena? So, a character name or role or attribute, and it may be a local phenomena, as are that character's emotions in a particular moment, whereas something like archetype or plot arc and things like that would be a more global. Some of these can be both. And we break this down further into whether these assessments should be deterministic, consensual, or perspectival. In other words, is there a correct right answer that a machine should be able to get? Would a bunch of people agree finally on a mean answer that seems a reasonable approximation? Or do we really want to capture a distribution of understanding, say around story mortals, where there's not going to be a single or even modal answer, but rather we have a range of possible answers, and so we want to model that. So this framework really tries to give researchers an access to the high dimensionality of narrative communication, and then also different evaluative frameworks that we can use depending on the dimension we're thinking about. And the idea here is this should give you a sort of foreshadowing of where I think we need to get to with story quality evaluation. So what happens when engineers measure stories? What are they evaluating? So I'll just take you through a couple example papers that have been influential, that I find very good, and walk you through what they're doing, and then sort of take a step back and think about this more holistically, because the literature is growing fast in terms of efforts to try and measure and model this. So Tien et al., they look at three dimensions. They look at the macro level, they call them story arcs, turning points, and then local sentiment. And so the story arc concept, very popular. They use Kurt Vonnegut as the framework, which many people have used. Matthew Jockers has done this. There's a paper from the Story Lab where they've done this. And the idea is that we can think of arcs of fortune that kind of rise and fall, and then you can kind of give names to these things. And basically, there are as many archetypes as there are curves you can draw. They also use this idea of turning point theory, which is a very cinematic approach, whereas the story arcs align much more with Freytag's narrative pyramid concept. So these are all different kind of backgrounds to these things, and it's very interesting when you follow the footnotes of where people are getting their information. Turning point theory just comes from some individual scholar who created these turning points to try and assess films. It's not really grounded in film theory. And then the last dimension is sentiment. And what you can see here, and I'll gesture towards this later, is these are all highly connected, right? So if you're looking at local sentiment over time, you're essentially modeling story arcs. And the kind of key findings that they come away with is that one, that models really privilege simplistic arcs, right? The man and whole, rise and fall, or fall and rise. Something bad happens, there's a turning point, and then everything gets resolved. Humans do too, but they have sort of more diversity in story structure. They also find this positivity bias. So if anybody has ever prompted a language model to tell them a story, you'll be very familiar with these problems. They're overly positive. They don't really deal with negative emotions well. They have this kind of like closing resolution bias. They really want to give you a takeaway. And so what we're seeing here is much more positivity in the graph on the lower left, with much lower arousal. They're just boring and flat, as what we see on the right, that all but evacuates by the end when it's doing its kind of like wrap up closure thing. So that graphic on the far right, I think, is a decent approximation of the problem, which is you just get these kind of like flat, uninteresting narrative from a narrative structural point of view. And that's the kind of key takeaway, right? So TNNL are basically measuring structural properties. They're doing it through a very particular framework. And it's not a bad idea. So there's been research, empirical research, to show that sentiment arcs are a very good predictor of audience preference. And so the more volatility there is, and the higher the magnitude of the volatility, correlates with audience preference data. So it's a good intuition, but to put it into context, we're at this like little place in our narrow bench, right? So these are the dimensions that this paper captures. So while they talk about a macro, meso, and micro dimensions, they're all highly correlated with one another, and they kind of fall into this small area in our schema. Go to the next paper by Chakrabarty, also a very popular one. This one takes a very different approach because it's in the field of human-computer interaction. Their approach is to ask experts. So the kind of HCI, human-computer interaction, that is a very prominent aspect of how they problem solve. So they go to these 8 experts, they pay them $70, and their job is to translate this concept of the Torrance test of creativity into a Torrance test of creative writing. So they take these dimensions of creativity that have been designed in social psychological research, and then they try and turn them into narrative dimensions. And that's what they're paid for. So they're basically asked, okay, take these dimensions and give us some narrative properties that correspond to them. And then that becomes their framework. The arrow is supposed to be pointing at CHI, so you can see where the venue is, but I also thought it was, it's always good to point out where academics are having conversations. So they end up with 14 questions. Right? And you can see how what's interesting about this paper is these questions cover a much more diverse range of narrative dimensions, right? So it's thinking about world building, it's thinking about characters, but it's also thinking about form, originality, plot coherence, emotion, surprise, and pacing. So there's sort of temporal aspects. And the final dimension to their testing is they have this kind of binary yes or no approach. In other words, you as a rater, as a human judge, you would say, okay, when I read the story, will an average reader of the story obtain a unique original idea from it? Yes or no? And then they do that for these 14 questions, and then that gives you a final score. And here are the kind of results that they present in their paper. So they use short stories from the New Yorker as their base reference data, and then they use those, they summarize them, and then use those to prompt the language models listed here to generate stories. So they're trying to control for content and not really style. I don't know the prompts. I'd have to look closer at the paper. I'm not even sure. They must release the prompts, but the one of the things that's going to come up is we all know from the research that there's a very strong relationship between prompt language and model behavior, not even to mention fine tuning and things like that. And so what a lot of these efforts involve seems to be very low prompt energy. I'm not sure if that's the technical term for it, but the idea is there's very little going on in terms of the prompting. So you're getting kind of a generic, what can the model do with minimal effort, which is, we'll come back to this at the end of the talk and in the Q&A, but that's a real problem for evaluation, because we know when people engage with language models, it's rarely a one shot, like, do this for me, and then they walk away and they take, they're satisfied with it. It's a conversational based experience. So a lot of people who are thinking about products in this space are thinking, like, how do we have an interactive tool to facilitate people's creativity? And that's a very different environment than just saying, write me a story. And then you get, as we know from language models, a very average mean kind of output. In any case, according to the Torrance test of creative writing, human stories from this New Yorker collection pass about 85% of the 14 questions. Right, so they get an average of an 85 out of 100, and LLMs get a 30. Right, again, not surprising. What we know, if we ever tried these experiments and asking language models to write stories, it's not surprising. But the key here is just to highlight very different dimensions that are being measured and very different approaches to measurement. And I want to just give you one more paper before I sort of do the step back component, because they have a really nice finding, which I think can add good food for thought and discussion. So in this particular paper, they evaluate 4 dimensions: novelty, surprise, diversity, and complexity. And they use an approach where they have both expert judges, non-expert judges, and language models as judges. Okay, so the top row, expert, non-expert, LLM, is the judge. The second row is who wrote the story. And on the left, you have human. On the right, you have AI. And then you have a 5-point scale according to their 4 categories: creativity, originality, surprise, and effectiveness. And what you can see here, the experts strongly prefer human writing. So on average, they're getting mid to high 3s. The AI stories are getting mid to low 2s. The funny part is when you go over to non-experts, and the way they find them is they go on Prolific, a kind of survey platform. And we can talk about the limitations of using a paid survey platform for extracting any reliable opinions from people at all. But we call these people non-expert judges. They go on, they read the same stories, and here the results are flipped. So the non-expert judges give AI stories 3.5 stars, or a rating of mid 3s, while the human stories get the low 2s. And what's also interesting is if you just go one more right over, you can see that the AI more strongly reflects the non-expert judgment than it does the expert judgment. There's been new research suggesting that, well, one caveat to this, as you all probably already know, is if you tell people who wrote the story, those judgments will flip. So if people don't know, they'll say, I like the AI story. If you tell them AI wrote it, they'll choose the human story, right? So there's an AI penalty that does not align with people's actual preference. And what's interesting is language models not only approximate non-expert judgments rather than expert judgments here, but they also have incorporated the distaste of AI. And so if you tell an LLM this was AI written versus human written, it'll flip its own judgments. So it's begun to incorporate that human value system, which is interesting and poses challenges for LLMs as judges. This is a bit too much in the weeds, but if you're curious as to what people are making their judgments on, they provide some statistical measures. Basically, the experts really like semantic diversity, in other words, more diverse language in the story, and that's precisely what the non-experts don't like. So you'll see the negative correlations in the non-expert column are strongly associated with lexical complexity and semantic diversity. In other words, the non-experts just don't like New Yorker style challenging stories, which tells you a lot about, as Dean was mentioning at the outset, the audience centeredness of storytelling. Who's this for? Who's rating it? What values are they bringing to this? And so forth and so on. Okay, so now I'm going to take a step back and try and synthesize. These are just a few examples of what are many papers, but I think they draw our attention to a set of problems that we need to think about if we're going to do narrative quality evaluation from artificial intelligence. Number one is that we have basically three different possible evaluation frameworks, right? We can ask humans to do this for us. We can use statistical measures, or we can ask language models, right? And so one of the challenges when you ask humans to be your raters is this idea of experts versus lay readers. And so you saw from the Chakrabarty paper, there's a real bias towards when we talk about experts, we mean MFA people. And it was interesting in their paper, they talk about getting experts to do this for them, but 30% of the people evaluating things were students. And no offense to the students in the audience, but the literal definition of a student is a non-expert. Regardless of that, notice that literary critics, humanists, academics who study literature for a living are not included in that framework, right? Which is, either a good choice or a bad choice, but it's still a choice that needs to be foregrounded. When we talk about lay readers, again, who are we talking about? And you can use platforms like Prolific, and you can say things like, I have a demographically balanced group of people that represent this kind of background, blah, blah, blah. There's enormous problems of language model, AI contamination in online platforms. It's particularly bad with platforms like Mechanical Turk. Prolific is working very hard to mitigate this. It's still a problem. We find about 10% of inputs are probably useless. That may be low, that may be high. But again, how much are people paying attention? How randomly are they clicking on buttons? This is a real issue when you're dealing with these online surveys. We've been exploring and experimenting with citizen science as another scalable way of looking at human evaluation. And we've been finding really wonderful engagement. We've run 4 projects now with well over 10,000 volunteers, upwards of 1.5 million annotations across all of those projects. So the scale is really quite amazing. The engagement is amazing. And the quality has turned out to be quite good as well. It aligns with whatever kind of like local student-oriented benchmarks we can create. We're seeing a very strong alignment there. So I see citizen science as a really interesting opportunity to do AI evaluation because it's very public-facing, and it makes the choices that go into AI training more transparent and less transactional. There's obviously statistical approaches that we saw, those sentiment arcs and plot arcs and things like that. The biggest limitation there is the limited number of features. So you saw in our Narrowbench the extraordinary dimensionality that you can bring to narratives, and I think Narrowbench is definitely on the low side. There's a lot more, I think, features you could add, and that we hope to, and that we hope people will. It's sort of meant to be a collective exercise. But there are also, conflicting features. Some people are studying this, some people are studying that. There's just no coordination, and that was kind of what I was seeing with narrative understanding half a decade ago. And so we're seeing the same phenomena happen again. There's also a really high correlation between features. The first paper is basically measuring sentiment arcs in various forms. The last paper I showed you where they had the expert versus lay, they have some statistical measures of novelty, surprise. They're basically all measuring the same thing. And you can obviously test correlations with your measures. And the papers don't do that, which is a big problem. And then obviously is the language we're using, the constructs we're invoking, are our measurements actually supporting that? The TN paper, for example. I had I had graphics. Sorry, my slides are intentionally very human looking, so they don't look like AI did them. But that also means sometimes I forget what's in them. Let me just jump ahead here. yeah, correlation between features. So novelty, surprise, diversity, complexity that you saw in that one paper, they're all highly correlated. Same with the problems in the other paper, Tian et al. And then construct validity, what you can see here is they use a construct of suspense when what they're measuring are sentiment arcs. And there's a real disconnect between the constructs and the vocabulary being invoked and the way they're being measured, right? There's just a kind of, a lack of rigor there. And when we talk about language models as judges, one of the biggest challenges is, language models as judges is a very risky undertaking because you end up with this circularity, right? The language model tells you that it likes the language model, or it will tell you a preference about a language model, and you're just going in circles, which makes the kind of humans in the loop so important. But there's also one of the approaches people use is preference learning. And so you try and train models on human preferences. And then the immediate question is, whose preferences are we learning? So there's an important paper called Litbench, and what they do is basically train models on this kind of upvote count on Reddit. And so it uses a data set of Reddit stories, and it basically says, yeah, these are the ones that are highly preferred. These are the ones that are lowly preferred. These must be good stories. These must be not good stories. And so the question is, like, what is that good for, right? What are we optimizing for? Or what are we learning in this preference learning? The next area, so if we have evaluation frameworks, right, and the options we have there and the problems associated with them that we need to think about, the other is obviously data. Which stories are we talking about? And this is sort of like input-output problem. In other words, which stories are we evaluating on? And implicit in that is which audiences or purposes are we evaluating for? A story produced for the New Yorker is thinking about a very particular type of reader and reading experience versus a story produced on Reddit versus a story that is produced to communicate a patient experience in a healthcare setting or a therapeutic setting, right? So these are all very different ways that stories serve purposes, and evaluation frameworks need to be much more clear about what problem they're solving. And so here are just some examples of the kinds of stories that are being used, and in some cases a little bit breathtaking. So the first one in this task, so Ismail Zada is using a psych measure of creativity where they ask you to tell a 5-sentence story using 3 keywords like stamp, letter, and send. And so they can be related, they can be disjunctive, and they're basically trying to assess your ability to think on your feet and kind of create a off-center narrative around these otherwise related things. This isn't the Litbench is the example I was telling you about that are using Reddit as the basis of human storytelling. And then funny, papers will say we focus on writing long form stories, 1,000 to 2,000 tokens. That is 500 to 1,000 words, approximately 1,200 words. For those of us in literary studies, that's definitely not what we would call long form. Long stories pose a real problem for language models, both for memory, attention, and just capacity, like inputting an entire 100,000 word novel into a model. Very few models can handle that. And then how they pay attention to that giant thing of text is a very interesting research question. Tian used movie synopses as their stories. And while I'm not averse to using summaries as representations of narratives for certain tasks, I think if you're evaluating progressive sentiment arcs and plot arcs, summary is really not appropriate at all. And then you have this just like tiny data set problem of 12 short stories from the New Yorker. So again, you can just see just how limited this is from a kind of cultural studies perspective, and a lot of work needs to be done here. This, I think, is just my closing slide, where I you know, what I do in my classes is I have these like story packets with examples from very different kinds of audiences. So, we have The Lion and the Mouse on the right, a classic fable. On the upper left, you have a Richard Ford's short story, Communist, and gives you an idea of what literary fiction is striving to do. And then on the bottom left, you have an example of a Reddit story and what its goals are, and where humor and attention getting is really so central to the practice. So you can imagine if you learn how to write stories in one of these veins, you're going to really struggle in another. Or if a model can write stories in all three of these genres successfully, that would really truly be impressive, because that really suggests that whole concept of like general intelligence. And we're clearly, a very long way away from there. And if you type into your browser right now, tell me a story, you'll get something that looks probably nothing like any of these initially, and then you can kind of work on it with more aggressive prompting, and you might begin to start approximating these things. So again, that's what I mean by this sequential compounding problem. Like, are we measuring the first output? Are we measuring the last output? What creative process are we modeling as well? And let me just put that back up. Actually, I'll just end there and go back to the window so I can see you all. There we go. Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's really fascinating to hear, particularly about the work that you're doing in your particular field. Before we open up to questions, I have one of my own to start off with. We've got models like ChatGPT or GPT-style systems that seem to struggle with long-range causal coherence, so maintaining that consistent character motivation across a whole novel, for instance. So I just wondered, do you see that as a solvable engineering problem, or does it reveal something more fundamental about the limits of a sort of mathematical or I suppose what I'm trying to say is, do you see that as a solvable engineering problem, or does it reveal something more fundamental about the limits of learning for narrative in a mathematical engineering capacity?
Um, I think it's a hard problem, but I don't think any of this is insurmountable. And I say that in a way that I'm not convinced that it's a good idea to do. And so I think one of the reasons AI labs have been so slow to figure out storytelling is because it has its kind of profit motive is uncertain, and its ethical motives are also uncertain. But I think from an engineering models at these tasks is really an engineering problem. In other words, they've been optimized to exactly not be creative. And so if you start, the whole process and try and optimize for New Yorker level creativity, or Reddit humor, or long novels where you're building out knowledge graphs, and there are ways in which you can build out memory functions to maintain plot consistency over time. I think it's it's certainly harder, right? We know, in models are measured over conversations, their memory degrades, and their accuracy and their ability to hold on to the thread of the conversation gets harder and harder over time. So this is in that sense a mathematical or a structural problem of AI models. But I definitely am of the opinion that I really think what we're seeing is just a lack of effort, and that if you put the same effort into coding optimization, into storytelling, you would get really marvelous outcomes. But again, maybe we don't want that, right? Maybe, but I suspect it's just a matter of incentive and energy, as opposed to limits of. I'm very skeptical of the like, well, that's a human function. I mean, we've just seen every claim to human specialty be demolished whenever models try and do something. So yeah, that would be my take on that.
I
But we'll see.
suppose I suppose one extension of that question could be, if a model can reliably predict what comes next in a story, does that tell us anything interesting about how humans understand narrative, or does prediction and understanding remain categorically distinct? Have you got anything on that sort of flip side of that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very related in some sense that, like, as we were building out Narrowbench and thinking about narrative measurement, it felt as though we were basically coming up with dimensions that you would want to think about for story generation. In other words, as you said, like the next word, next sentence problem is a very interesting one when you read stories. So if you go back and read that Richard Ford story, the first thing like my students will always talk about is there's a degree of uncertainty and surprise from one sentence to the next as a reader that is so different from when you're reading an AI written story where it's like, yep, cliche, cliche, cliche. Um, and I think so far we've done some experimentation with just like model weights of like is the surprise function or the perplexity function of a model given a next word or a next sentence, like is that informative of storytelling quality or storytelling features? It's not clear yet. People have done it and we've shown how their models are actually uh, very fallible. Like there's problems with the way they're doing it. So we've got a replication paper coming out on a narrative flow paper. So I think the verdict is still out on whether intrinsic model knowledge aligns well with human feelings about storytelling, right? So if you just kind of unpack the innards of a model, can it tell you of like, oh yeah, the more surprising it looks from the model's perspective, the happier and more surprising it'll be from a human perspective. I think we have a lot, we'll see on that front. And because that's not super well aligned, that tells me that the translation from just model blob to good stories is going to be challenging.
Hmm. Okay, so I think we'll go to audience questions now. Has anybody got any questions for Andrew? You can either raise your hand or put something in the chat. Marcus, you've got a question.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting talk. You mentioned your biases and towards in AI stories, positivity and closure, maybe kind of cliched plot narratives or that kind of thing. And I think you touched on this, but where does you think that comes from? Is that pre-training, sort of an averaging of stories, or is that training on human reinforcement on human preferences, or where do you see that?
I'm assuming it comes with the reinforcement learning. And some colleagues have done some probing of this. So I don't know if you know the Olmo trace. I always get the acronyms wrong too. Sorry if that's not the exact name of it, but there is a kind of the Allen Institute has built out a system where you can try and locate in the training data where outputs are coming from. So it's just doing a like string matching thing. And what they're finding using that tool is that kind of vanilla storytelling prompting seems to be traceable back to reinforcement learning, the reinforcement learning data partition, and not the pre-training. Whereas if you ask for more like, tell me a story in the style of Richard Ford, it'll kind of leapfrog the reinforcement learning data and go back to the pre-training. So I think a lot of that contained crappiness stuff happened when people were just being like, yeah, that seems like a safer, better, clearer story type. And then it kind of hobbled hobbled the creativity. So again, that's a layperson, right? I'm not an AI engineer, but given what I seen other people trying to scratch the surface of where this problem is located, I think that's a big culprit.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thanks.
Any other questions for Andrew at all? Helen's got a hand up.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Thank you very much for that. It was great. Thank you very much. I'm very much an interested amateur because my background's in philosophy and theology, so I'm just kind of dipping my toe in this. So forgive me if I'm not that well versed on everything. But one thing that just did occur to me listening to you was whether it's also possible to kind of reverse engineer a narrative. The only reason I asked that was because I have colleagues who work in textual editing and textual criticism of things like biblical text, historical text, that sort of things, where they're trying to look at things like intertextual influences and things like this, and whether other, priority the gospels and things like that. And they spend years looking at things like voices, whether there's a different narrator here because there's a different narrator. So it seems like it's the reverse actually, where we've got the finished product and we're actually trying to kind of reverse engineer it to find out who the authors were. And it just made me think it's odd because we're kind of in the stage at the moment where we kind of know who the authors are and we get the end text, but they're obviously working the other end of things where they're trying to reverse engineer it. And I think they're starting to make the first steps into using AI for that. And it made me think a lot of this would be really useful actually to understand how it works the other way, to then use the similar tools to kind of look back historically into these texts to see if we can actually pull apart the voices that are in a text. So I didn't know whether.
Yes. So that's the, like, what I would say is like the bread and butter of what I've done in the past. In other words, the textual analysis using computational modeling can be a very powerful tool for thinking about provenance, authorship, influence. One of the challenges of that is, this is where like humanism was born, which is basically like thinking about context and how much that plays a role in your judgment. So, when Lorenzo Valla's doing the donation of Constantine, he's disproving the authorship of a text because he knows so much about the context, and he can say that these words would never have appeared in this century, given what we know about that century versus this century. And so I think we've done a lot of work of saying, okay, well, the stylistic signature here compared to the stylistic signature here, and we can sort of get reasonable statistical approximations of similarity and so forth and so on. But what's always challenging is that historical context. And that's what we kind of, as researchers, bring to that interpretation. But it is very hard to validate, right? Because it's like, well, I know about this, and I bring this in and that in. And so one thing that language models, if you start thinking about fine tuning or historically constructed ones, so there's people kind of working in this area as well, where you're building that context into the automated judgments. So you're not just looking at strings within text, but you're also saying, okay, well, that judgment we know should be grounded by this external knowledge too. And that's where AI potentially ups that process a little bit, makes it interesting, but it also makes it challenging to validate because their behavior is weird. You're always dealing with an alien intelligence, and so it's like, is that right? Is that wrong? So this is sort of the other calls. I think humanists have a very strong role to play in critiquing the way AI is being evaluated, but also informing, from an expert point of view, the way AI can be created, right? And I think that there's really interesting opportunities there that from historical knowledge, domain knowledge, cultural knowledge, and so forth. So these are sort of my pitches for why humanists should care about AI. But yeah, I think that's a really classic case study and makes a lot of sense.
It's interesting as well what you said about the kind of the biases or the distaste for the readership for when they discover that something's AI, because the last Humane lecture we had a young artist join, and that was one of the things that she was constantly asked about, was whether once people that were interested in her work found out that there was an AI element, whether that affected how they judged her art. So, and I think it was a concern that she had, and some of the other people shared as well. So it seems to be something that crosses across different disciplines actually. So it seems to be a common problem that we need to be aware of, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the approaches we use with our citizen science framework is, and we use Zooniverse as our base platform, and they're an amazing organization, and they were the ones that really pushed us to say, look, transparency is the most important thing, because people have very strong feelings about this. And so, if you're an artist, there was a case, I don't know if it made its way, I actually don't know where the book was published, but there was I think it was a North American book, and it got pulled because people found out it was AI authored, and readers just like totally revolted. They started putting terrible ratings on Goodreads, and they were just very angry. And I think it really is up to you as an author to say, like, this is an AI generated product, let's assess it for that, or this is an AI co-created artwork, make sure you're telling people, because that moment they feel like it's been smuggled in is where the anger comes from. And it would, someone other than me would be good at figuring out why that's happening, psychologically, socially, and ethically. But it's definitely the case. And so when we do our evaluations on citizen science, we say, look, this is an AI generated product that we want you to help look at, or what you're evaluating will be used to better train a model to be more culturally sensitive, or whatever it is. So really flagging where it's showing up in the process is just like a good mantra to use, whatever your area of study is.
Thank you.
Robert Davis has got a question as well.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. I haven't got like a specific question. I was just kind of riffing on what you'd said. It's just amazing. That's the whole thing about attending these sessions. I think it's to really learn stuff that we hadn't thought about. I was just wondering, I'm picking up on what Helen asked about the authorship of these documents. Would the AI be useful if it wasn't trained, if it couldn't look at the original Greek, for example, in those manuscripts? I mean, if the AI model is not trained on the Greek text, is it useful for looking for authorship of ancient documents?
Yeah, so this is the like limitless amount of work we have to do if we want to use AI to facilitate our research at some kind of analytical level, whether it's assessing more texts or assessing these very granular textual relationships. We just have to test whether they can do these tasks. And so, my lab, we spend a lot of time just evaluating, well, we want to study this narrative dimension. Does any model understand what we mean by this? And so we do a lot of like human evaluation locally. And that's where the citizen science allows us to kind of like scale these assessments. So, as a non-domain expert, I don't know how it handles classical languages. The multilingual capacities of models are very impressive, of frontier models. Yeah. On the other hand, they are not equally distributed, right? They're better at some languages than others. So I don't know about ancient languages. For sure, there are likely people out there, if models are not great at it, they're probably training, or tuning, or improving models to be better at it. And generally, we find that you really can boost analytical possibilities of models with domain expertise. And so that's the kind of next wave, right? Is models designed in the same way for the workforce. That's what we're going to see, right? They're starting with coding, but then they're going to move into medicine and academically, we can do the same thing, right? We can have models be very good on ancient texts. We can have models be very good at early modern texts, and so forth and so on. So I think that's another aspect where, and again, engineers aren't going to solve this by themselves, right? They just don't have that cultural background to do that. And it's, that's something humanists can really do, is give AI that is much more culturally aware. Right? That's kind of one of the projects we're working on in my lab that's being funded by the Schmidt Sciences. We call it sort of AI for historical and cultural reasoning. And so the goal is like, what can we do to make these models not be too present bias, too North American bias, right? So that's a big issue.
Yeah. And I just thought, like, a bit of an observation, it was a bit depressing that people prefer the AI generated stories and that the AI prefers it seems to be just like generating AI slop, or just some kind of lowest common denominator, doesn't it? I think, if we don't have people who can break these molds of writing and write in extraordinary ways, we would just not have any advancement at all, would we? In literature or things like that. What do you think about that? Is that a problem we're going to have in the future, do you think?
I'm weirdly an optimist. So I think human creativity is not going anywhere, and people will want to continue to push the boundaries of their own production or creativity, and that's where we get good stuff. And that said, most of culture is very predictable, kind of sloppy, and that's just also human nature. So I don't know. I think my bigger concern is the sloppy middle, and not the impressive boundaries. Like, I assume that will maintain itself, and it's kind of like, how do we manage the middle slop stuff?
Well, I guess even Charles Dickens wrote for the popular market, didn't he? Because he was selling them on a periodical basis, wasn't he? So
Yeah,
you can
and
still get good
navigating that
literature.
is
Yeah.
always a challenge. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Russell, I've got his hand up.
Yeah, interesting talk, Andrew. Thanks very much. I was just going to comment that it doesn't surprise me at all that Gen AI likes averagely crappy material, since that's what it's trained on. You know, the majority of people aren't reading highbrow, high culture material. They're reading generic stuff, and essentially most models, unless you're very careful in how you're prompting them, are going to churn out that sort of thing, because that's the most likely stuff to come out. So it's, I think, in a way, not at all surprising that it's that people can prefer, the majority of people can prefer that sort of stuff. I think where it becomes interesting is if you try and focus output on particular genres and so forth, as to whether you can then achieve results such that human experts rank it alongside other really well produced human material. But you've got to be very good in your prompting. I don't know if you've either come across research in that space or done anything like that yourself, where you're really trying to focus stuff on high-end literary work.
So I haven't seen it. I will say anecdotally that if one of the exercises I do with my class is to say, the assignment is prompt until you get a story that feels like a very high quality story. So literary fiction quality. And there's always a ceiling. Like it never quite gets there. But you definitely can make improvements. Like that Torrance test 85-30 ratio, you could boost it for sure, if you prompted for each specific dimension. I mean, this is something we kind of learn in the process, is that what you really need to do is say, okay, let's work on this character. Okay, now let's create a better conflict. Like you have to do that kind of editorial work. And this is what I mean by about like the point of it all, because will people find that that's a rewarding experience to really just like manage an AI's creativity? Maybe, I don't know. Or is it like, why am I doing this? Why don't I just write it myself?
Have you found people become better at writing it by going through that process? Because they, it's like learning by teaching. Effectively, if you've got to work with the Gen AI to get it to do the sorts of things that you think are important, you're kind of learning that actually working on character is actually quite helpful. And I don't know, again, if you've got any reflections on whether your students have actually found it from a pedagogical point of view a useful exercise.
That's a great question. I don't know. This is something that people really should study. In other words, is there a creativity bump by interacting with an AI to generate stories that exceeds if I just said, go write a story, and I provided, again, expert feedback. And I suspect, I mean, the literature seems to be growing that what happens is with your broad middle, they get a boost with AI interaction. And I don't think that's been measured on creativity and creative writing, but in other tasks, generally what the literature suggests is if it's supervised, like you can't just have students like talk to the AI by themselves. Like that doesn't do anything because they don't know what they're doing. But if you have a highly structured teacher-led interactive framework, it looks to be the case that you can bump up student performance, and it's often the people in the middle or the back that will get the gains. And so, if we think about storytelling, like we all have the natural ability to do it. Some are better than others. We think about written stories and high quality stuff, like that's a 1%er problem, right? Most of us are not good at this. And I'm sure I would get better at it with an interactive process, using AI. So I think if we always sort of train our view to like, what's the goal? And the goal here would be like, I mean, think about it in younger schools, the gender schism around the humanities versus the sciences, and thinking about getting people who are sort of allergic to reading and writing, giving something that kind of like taps into that and pulls it out of them and helps develop it. That to me seems like an awesome opportunity. And it seems to reason that an AI might be able to do that because it's going to be able to do a lot more than a teacher with 30 kids can do. So, that's where I get optimistic about it, is that at that individual prompting level, as opposed to the aggregate, like what's the internet going to look like with a lot of AI produced stuff. I think those are two very different problems. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you very much. Marcus, I've got his hand up.
Yeah. You mentioned that even with repeated prompting, you improve the stories, but they reach a ceiling. What do you think? What's happening at that ceiling? What are the limits?
This is where it gets really hard to say. Like the biggest thing we experience in my classes when we do this is just like a vocabulary for describing what's wrong. Like it's very, and so all these taxonomies we create, like these are just ways of trying to like surface into human intuitions. And human intuitions about creativity are very fuzzy. And again, this makes sense why people are starting with coding and math and those things, because they're just, they have clearer outcomes. And so I think the feeling of why something just doesn't quite feel like Richard Ford is kind of hard to articulate. And so I often come back to, I've got like a few heuristics that again, this is all me surveying the literature as opposed to really studying this problem deeply. But my initial intuitions are things like theory of mind. So when you're reading Ford's Communists, one of the things that'll happen is somebody is saying something about somebody else. And now you're 3 layers of theory of mind. You've got the narrator telling you about a character, telling you about a character. That's really hard to do in a kind of convincing but compelling way. And I think AI, like the AI stories I read, just cannot do that. And then there's sort of a like situatedness of characters in the world. You'll see when AI, excuse me, when AI tells stories, they're just kind of like indexes, right? There's like a name, or it's a grad student, or a there's always the clockmaker. I've got somebody working on a paper of like, why all the stories, vanilla stories, have clockmakers? It's like Elias the clockmaker. Where did he come from? They're not round like the round flat character thing that we talk about in creative writing. They're never round. They don't have any depth. They don't have any like, okay. And all characters are archetypal, right? Like that's what makes them intelligible. But it's that added dimensionality to them. If you read Communist, it's a really wonderful story, and it's a very straightforward triangle. There's a mother, a son, and then the father is gone, and there's a boyfriend who's like the substitute father. So you have like the perfect narrative triangle. It's been done a bazillion times. So there's something very pat and structural about it, and yet it's very surprising and eerie and odd what happens. And so that some of it may just be emotional depth, right? It's that emotional uncertainty, richness, subtlety, nuance, terms like subtext. AI just it's not there for that, and that may be experiential. This may go to, I think, Dean, you were asking about, mathematical limitations. This just may be reasoning limitations, which I'm always hesitant to invoke. But without living in a body in the world and having social interactions, it may be hard to simulate. I don't know. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, these are we're always just guessing about what the intelligence can and can't do. So
Thank you very much. Anybody else got perhaps a final question for Andrew? If not, then I can go straight to sort of question I was going to use to wrap up today anyway. So looking back at everything that we've discussed today, the issues that you've raised, the various points that have been explored in discussions from those attending, I just wonder, what do you think the humanities most urgently needs to say to the people building these systems, and do you think they're listening?
Call us. It's literally like, please get humanists involved. And I think that initiative out of the Schmidt Sciences Foundation is really valuable, because that's one of its aims, is to say, we think humanists do have important things to contribute to this engineering problem, because it's not just an engineering problem, right? It is a cultural and social one. These technologies are getting deployed out in the world for social purposes. They're creating representations. That is what the humanities excel at and studying. And on the one hand, I'm a vocal critic of papers that lack humanists on them, that are talking about basically humanistic things. But I'm also a vocal critic of the humanities. We can work harder at this and getting involved. In other words, we need to show that we're like productive interlocutors and collaborators. And so having these constructive conversations and collaborating with AI folks is also part of the kind of how to get to the table thing. But I think if we can get involved more and show that the limitations, as opposed to just a sheer like we just don't want it, right? Which I understand where that comes from, but a constructive approach towards improving it for social, cultural, humanistic purposes, I think that gives us a real opportunity to play a very prominent role as AI evolves over time, which is, I think the humanities have like a really renewed role as this thing gets increasingly technologized and spread. So I think we have work to do, and there's some neat opportunities there, but we have to engage in it in ways that show that we're kind of also understanding the problems from the engineering side.
Thank you very much. So I think that pretty much just wraps up today's session. Again, thank you to Andrew for giving up his time and preparing that presentation. I'm sure we've all learned a lot about not just his work, but some of the ideas that are floating around in that particular academic community, and some of the issues that perhaps we need to think of moving forward. Thank you to those who have been here and who have contributed questions or made observations. Your input is always greatly appreciated and enriches the sort of the fabric of these sessions for everyone involved. I will send out the recording, and if Andrew wants me to, any links to his work and to his current projects, so people can have a look in their own time and have a look at what Andrew is up to in his research. But again, yeah, thank you very much for attending today. It's been again another great conversation, another great debate between us, and we look forward to hopefully seeing some of you at the next session.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Bye.